Yes, our speaker tonight is Jane Tillman, and on gardening for birds with native plants. Jane's very active in NIPSOT. She was a past president of the Austin chapter. Has taught beginning backyard birding classes, talks about Central Texas birds and gardening in the Austin area. She also teaches and helped create the the NLCP, the Native Landscape Certification Program on landscaping for birds class. So it's my pleasure to turn it over to Jane.
Tonight, we're going to talk about gardening for birds with native plants and how you can make your yard more appealing to birds so that you'll draw more in for with the wonderful benefits of listening to all the bird song and getting all that bird activity. So we're going to look at some plants, and Tim and I looked at the lists that were in the NIPSOT database and in the native art, and I also looked at the Wildflower Center to make sure that these plants that I'm mentioning are okay for your area. Some may be just a little bit out of range. So we're also going to look at easy to implement garden practices, which are kind of contradictory to what we were just hearing right before this talk. But the goal is for you to get excited about birds if you're not already, and to appreciate the bird plant connections in your yard and things that you can do to make your yard even birdier. So as people do, birds need the following things: water, space, food, shelter, and places to raise young. And water is critical. If you do nothing else, put out some water and make it shallow and keep it clean. Space, kind of the amount of space that birds need is really dependent on what species we're talking about, whether it's a little cardinal that probably can get by on, 2 to 5 acres versus a short-eared owl or a great horned owl that needs a couple hundred acres of different type habitat. So we can't really do too much about that in our yards. But after we get past water and space, native plants really do the rest of the heavy lifting for birds in our yards. And long before bird feeders, which are nice, but actually come with their hazards, such as the bird flu going around right now, long before bird feeders, native plants were meeting birds' needs. And there are many reasons to go back to natives for the birds. So these are plants, as you know, you all probably have been thinking about this topic for a while. These are plants that have been here for a really long while, and they've co-evolved to provide wildlife with the things that they need at the time they need it. So this is American beautyberry, which we all are familiar with. It provides nectar for pollinators early on and sets these beautiful fruits that then birds, especially mockingbirds, cherish in the fall. So native plants are doing the job. And the other great thing about plants like this one in particular, is that birds can forage underneath. Some years you may notice that they don't eat all the American beautyberries, and I don't really understand why that happens, but eventually those should shrivel up and fall to the ground and hopefully become food for somebody. So native plants are beneficial, as you know, because many of them are adapted to our droughts and floods. Of course, they are site specific. They're adapted to our soils, or down here in Austin, we joke about our lack of soil. They're disease resistant, but that doesn't mean that things don't chew on them. As a matter of fact, they do. And that's a great thing about our native plants, is that we do have insects chewing on them. And that's where we get into the last one, which is why I like native plants so much, is besides their beauty and the fact that they belong here, they provide food and habitat for wildlife. And if you haven't read anything by Douglas Tallamy, and at this point I can't imagine you haven't, those are a couple of his books, and he has a third one about the nature of oaks, which are all great. But native plants basically provide more than one thing for wildlife. It's not just birds here. It could be something like this pipevine swallowtail that's getting nectar on the lantana, which then, possibly helps pollinate it. And we end up with those wonderful little berries that birds like our delightful little ruby-crowned kinglet that comes for the winter will eat during the off season. And these little berries are a good source of carbohydrates and possibly fat for the birds. So so native plants do double and triple duty for these birds. And bird plant connections like a mockingbird eating a yopon berry, that's pretty obvious. We get it. We go, sure, I got to have a yopon. But one like this might be a little more obscure. So one day I was at the Wildflower Center and they have these demonstration beds and, single plant, and their Salvia farinacea or mealy blue sage was just alive with bees, whether it was some of them were our native bumblebees, and then just the regular, non-native honeybees. And this just was, well, blue is one of their favorite colors. And you think, well, yeah, we know we need these insects for pollination, but so how does that really relate to birds? Well, it just so happens that our summer tanager, which is generally a summer bird for us, they'll get back here late March, April, and stay through the season with a few that overwinter. But they are bee and wasp specialists. As a matter of fact, down in Mexico, some of them are shot by beekeepers because they go after their bees. And the male is on the left, the female is on the right. And right outside my office window, she was whacking a wasp, you can see. And it's really, really fun to watch these birds kind of soften up something that actually must be slightly crunchy before it goes down the hatch. But, we got to have bees and wasps to have birds like this that have co-evolved with them. Here's an example of a little simple food web, which kind of illustrates the way things go. Here you've got a Gulf fritillary caterpillar on a passion flower vine. And here it's pupated and it's come out as an adult Gulf fritillary, and it's nectarine on Turk's cap in this case. And then in this next slide, we have unfortunately, a Gulf fritillary that's been caught by a praying mantis. And here we have the scissortail flycatcher eating a praying mantis. So just one little snapshot of how a food web works with many different parts. So I think it's really important because a lot of people think of birds as just eating seeds. They come to a feeder or they put out a hummingbird feeder, and that's about as far as they go. But it's really, that really doesn't give enough acknowledgement to all the different things that birds eat. And of course, it does depend on what species you are. So what do birds eat? Well, here's just a short list. They love invertebrates of all types. Nectar, clearly, for some of our birds. Fruits, berries, nuts, seeds, foliage, and buds, which might surprise you, and vertebrates. So again, and so I'm going to go through each of these and illustrate with the plants that I find do a pretty good job of feeding the birds. So we know that birds eat a lot of invertebrates, and invertebrates can be something like aphids, which is the case in this picture here. There's a little yellow-rumped warbler, which is a wintering warbler, and it's eating the aphids off of a little legume. So this is not necessarily something you have in your yard unless you have kind of a wild yard or you back up to a green space that's a bit wilder. But nonetheless, aphids have a slightly sweet taste, and these birds, as well as orange-crowned warblers, kind of like sweet, so it's not surprising it's going after that. Here's a Carolina wren, definitely a backyard bird, that's eating on an insect, and then an ash-throated flycatcher, which is a bird that, and all these birds should occur in your area, so I kind of double-check that. This is more a bird of open country, though. They like dragonflies. Lots of birds in the kind of tyrant flycatcher family eat a lot of dragonflies. So insects, how important are they to bird? Well, think about this little chickadee, which is a common backyard bird if you're in a wooded area. It needs to capture and feed its young 6 to 9,000 caterpillars. And when you think about that, it's kind of an amazing, mind-boggling number, because you probably don't just have chickadees in your yard. You're also trying to support Carolina wrens, and you're probably supporting some titmice, and at least might be mockingbirds or maybe cardinals, and they're all over about you know, depending on how good the year is for producing food, from maybe like a 12 to 16 day nestling phase before the little birds are ready to fledge and get out of the nest. So what do those caterpillars in particular do for the birds? Well, they do provide a good mix of fat, protein, and carbohydrates. And some, but not all caterpillars are a good source of the carotenoids, which are the things, the bright orange and reds that are then uh, captured and put into the color, say, of your summer tanager or your northern cardinal. And plus, there is some, I guess, research being done on how carotenoids contribute to immunity and also to sperm production in birds. So basically, when you think about how important insects, particularly caterpillars, are, you think, gosh, maybe I should be gardening for caterpillars, instead of anything else. Maybe that's my priority. Douglas Tallamy estimates that your yard needs to be about 70% native in order to support a bird like a chickadee family. And so here's a really interesting slide that starts having us look at, well, what are the good plants that we can be kind of zoning in on or focusing on to have more caterpillar abundance in our yard. And you see that these that I've listed, quercus, the prunus, salix, and the ulmus, so oaks, cherries, plums, Mexican plum type, willow, and elms, those are some of the plants that produce or support the highest number of species of caterpillars. And you can contrast that here with non-native Nandina, which I assume you all have up there. It's heavenly bamboo. So far, it has been, I don't know how long it's been in the US, but it hasn't been here long enough that anything has figured out how to eat it and then pupate on it and hatch and go on to feed birds. Of course, it does provide berries, but that can be problematic for the birds. Some ligustrums are being able to support some very generalist caterpillars. But nonetheless, what we're thinking about here is, how then can we maybe introduce more of these particular plants into our landscape? And one is any of the oaks, any of the Quercus genus are going to probably be good host plants for butterflies and caterpillars. And you're thinking, well, gosh, I don't see any of those butterflies and caterpillars in my yard. Well, maybe you do. And during the spring, when the live oaks are losing their leaves, and it's about warbler time, so getting on into April, you've got these little oak rollers that come out of the trees and on little tiny webs, and basically they are in the they're tortricid moths, and they're falling to the ground, and then they'll burrow and pupate and then come out as little moths. Well, those are just really like the best baby food for a bird that's trying to feed its young, or whether it's a bird like a black and white warbler that may be summering here, but it may be going much further north to breed. And that's good food for them, just as they're migrants coming through. So Douglas Tallamy and other researchers with him have found that these keystone species, and this is the ones on the left are trees, and then we'll get to the ones on the right in a minute. They found that 14% of the plants native plants provide or support 90% of the native caterpillars or native Lepidoptera, butterflies and moths that are used by birds. So 14%, if we can have these plants well represented, then we're helping get those birds back producing their young like they need to stem the decline of the 3 billion birds lost. Now on the right, and I know there was some talk earlier about Solidago, but besides those keystone trees, we also have some keystone perennials, for example, or annuals, but Solidago, so the goldenrods are wonderful for specialist bees that only eat the pollen of certain plants. So there's a lot of research being done on that right now. The other thing is Solidago genus is a pretty darn good host plant for butterflies and moths. And so when I say host plant, you've got to have that particular plant in order to provide the plant for the caterpillars to chew and then pupate, etc. So the other one is the asters. So Asteraceae, there are some plants like Texas aster and the goldenrods that are really important for bees. Some of these bees only emerge when their host plants, so to speak, bloom, and then they can gather the pollen from those and feed their young. So these are keystone plants in the landscape. And if we don't have them, then our ecosystem can kind of collapse. It's not a good thing. So if you want to kind of use this fun tool, it's easy to Google search NWF Native Plants Finder and put in your zip code. So I put in one for up in y'all's area just to see if it was pretty similar to the numbers of Lepidoptera that were supported as in my area. And it really was. It didn't change too much. So then you can look at these and say, okay, Prunus genus, what do we have that would be something we could plant in the Collin County area? Is it walnuts, oaks? What kind of plum tree do you have up there? Well, Mexican plum apparently will do okay up there. And you would know better than I, like which elms you want to choose, that kind of thing. So it's some of the recommendations I think need improvement, and they call this still in beta testing because it's not totally fine-tuned. The other thing, if we're really gardening for caterpillars in particular, is to think about ways to leave the leaves on the ground. Now, I know this might be just the opposite of what you want to do, particularly if you're feeling like cleaning up is the order of the day. But leaf litter is a place for caterpillars to pupate. Leaf litter also, as it's broken down by all those little insects that eat detritus, it helps build soil and it reduces compaction of the soil, which then makes it easier for caterpillars and other insects to burrow into the soil for whatever duration they need before they emerge as adults. It's nature's blanket in that it provides a constant humidity that helps any little amphibians and reptiles that might be trying to overwinter, for example. And then it's also shelter for them. So leaving the leaves, there's great articles by the Xerces Society. When you think about the fact that we have one butterfly, the dusky blue ground streak, that actually spends the winter as a caterpillar eating leaves. So, so if you start, and the other thing to remember is that your caterpillars, usually 90% of them don't pupate on the plant that they just chewed up. They'll fall to the ground and wander a bit and then pupate somewhere else, whether it's on stems of plants that then we cut down, and put them in the compost before those poor little pupa have had a chance to emerge as adults. So some of this, you just have to decide what level of messiness you might want in your yard, but knowing that waiting to cut things back till, if you can stand it, into March, so that that first generation of moths and butterflies can emerge, then you're doing your birds a big favor. And I found in my yard that since I'm not cutting back, oh my gosh, there's so much activity of birds using the dead stalks and things as perch sites as they prop up to eat seeds, for example, that are left on plants like Texas aster. So the other thing to remember is to kind of shelve the pesticides, because all these things can be knocked out by pesticides. And that's the exact opposite of what we want to do, because we want our birds to be able to eat and be our natural insect control. So unless you really have an infestation, try to be tolerant of chewed plants. So we'll move on and say, okay, this is the fun part. What do birds eat? Well, we have our hummingbirds, which are obvious nectar eaters or drinkers. And then we also have birds like our some of our orioles and our house finches, our finches. But basically things like orchard oriole is the one I think of, will come to feeder. And so so our hummingbirds, of course, like anything that's red, but once they come into your yard, they'll try other colors out too. And here's one, a little black-chinned, that's probably helping a little bit with pollination as it goes to that Turk's cap. And notice that this Turk's cap, that it's got a lot of chewed leaves on it. And I think in this case, it's a little short-horned grasshopper, because my yard has quite a few of those. So it maybe looks a little bit unsightly, but it certainly doesn't harm the production of flowers on this particular plant. So tolerating a little chewed, is a good thing. Here's a plant that I have not really seen in landscape so much, but I'm telling you, in the native landscape, like wild areas, it is, even though it's it's a plant that's adapted to having its feet wet all the time. It's on pond edges. At Lake Travis here in Austin, we've got some that's really far from the water, like, 100 yards or so, and they look great. And it makes these beautiful little balls. And here's this little black-chinned hummingbird coming to nectar at it. And then it sets wonderful seeds that birds will eat. And wood ducks are one that really like to eat the seeds. And here we have a picture of a monarch nectaring on buttonbush. So I think in a landscape with, decent water to get it established, after that, it should be fairly drought tolerant. And it's a large kind of deciduous bush. It's pretty. Red buckeye and Mexican buckeye are both great understory trees or shrubs, if you want to call them that. The Mexican buckeye spreads out sort of horizontally, so it's good under utility poles. It blooms about the same time as our red buds. So I think some people get them mixed up, but it actually is the Mexican buckeye on the left is a good source of nectar. It is a host plant for one particular little butterfly, the Henry's elfin. But again, it's not really the butterflies that are so critical to our birds. It's really the moths. In Texas, I can never remember, in Texas, we have 4,700 species of moths and about 481 species of butterflies. I don't know how many in your area. In our area, it's about 1,700 moths and 175 or so butterflies. So that's what we're after, is trying to provide for them. So on the right, we have the wonderful red buckeye, which is also early nectar, glossy leaves. It's just now beginning to set the buds. They're forming, and it is a little bit higher concentration of sugar to water. It's about, whereas the stuff that you make, hummingbird nectar, is about 20% dilution. This is about 25% sugar. It's about 3-to-1 instead of 4-to-1. So it really gives those little migrating hummingbirds an extra boost. Chili patine is a really good little easy to grow plant that you can use for culinary reasons. But I have to tell you, your cardinals are crazy about it. It's called bird pepper. And a cardinal is a rather heavy bird, so it can't really perch on this plant very easily and pick off the fruits or berries, but they will fall to the ground, and that's where those cardinals can access them. And this is what it looks like at this time of the year. So if we're going to have another cold spell that y'all were talking about, it's like, well, I'll be pulling those off and putting them on the ground so my birds, my berry eaters, have something to eat. It's very easy to grow. It grows more densely, so more compact in full sun and a little bit lankier in shade, but it's so easy to grow. And the birds do spread the seeds around. So be prepared to do a little weeding or just rejoice you've got more of it. Berries, we all know yaupon and possum haw are very popular with birds like your robins and your cedar waxwings. In this picture, there are cedar waxwings all through it, and this is the possum haw. So the deciduous holly. At the end of the day, on this very cold day, there were no berries left on this possum haw. So that one really shows nice and red in the winter. It's a nice shrub. This is the yaupon, and I took this probably in May, so the berries were not, turning red or anything. They're just still developing. But Ricky Lennox says that you get a lot more fruit produced in open versus a yaupon that's in the shade, 19 times the amount of fruit in the sun conditions. So that's a very popular plant with our cedar waxwings this time of year. Whether it's ash juniper or eastern red cedar, these plants provide wonderful berries for birds. Plus, they can be really nice sort of specimen plants in a landscape, and they provide shelter for birds to kind of break those cold, bitter winter winds that we have. And that kind of makes me wonder, do berries care if a berry is native? And there's some work being done by Susan Smith Pagano from Rochester Institute in New York. And she finds that the native plants like hackberry berries are about 50% fat by weight, whereas the non-natives like this privet are just they're just hardly contribute anything. Now they are eaten, the birds do eat them, but that's because, it might be their only choice. The other thing that she finds is that birds that just have a bunch of non-natives as their food supply don't spend as much time foraging as they do in something that's native. So there's more work to be done in this to understand, what level of fat is being provided, because fat is a good thing, maybe not for humans, but fat helps birds get through the cold winter, or it helps them get fattened up for migration, which requires a lot of energy. So some birds, as we know, like nuts and seeds, whether it's our blue jay that's crazy about acorns and actually will carry between 5 and 7 in its esophagus, its little gular kind of pouch, and they are very good at picking healthy acorns and that don't have weevils in them, and then they go and cache them, and they don't find all of them when it comes time to excavate one. And so it's thought that they helped replant the forests of North America after the last mini ice age back about 12,000 years ago. On the left, we have a little lesser goldfinch, and I understand y'all don't have that many lesser goldfinches, but that they do occur in your area. Anyway, they are big seed eaters, and here it is on probably an annual sunflower. Your house finches would be big fans too, and pine siskins that come for the winter. And yeah, wood ducks like acorns, and they are a bird sometimes of retention ponds, wooded retention ponds that you might have in your area. So any of the salvias provide tiny seeds And birds have different sized bills. And so a small bird like this little lesser goldfinch is very happy with little minuscule seeds that you and I probably would go, wow, what's the problem? What's the reason to even bother? But scarlet sage, which is also called tropical sage, the drill. Salvias are native plants. Better to ask for them by their scientific name. Anyway, Salvia coccinea, I've seen lesser goldfinches perching on these stalks and picking out the seeds. And then on the lyre leaf sage, which somebody mentioned that they're having to pull some of theirs out, that plant I've watched birds, the little lesser goldfinches, coming to perch on the stalks, and the stalks kind of go all the way to the ground. The bird just rides it to the ground and back up and picks the seeds out. So it's a delightful little plant and a delightful source of seeds for these birds. So here's an example of an aster family plant. On a sunflower is a Nashville warbler, probably not going after the seeds because it's a warbler and they don't eat too many seeds unless we have a couple that do, but it's not common. Anyway, lots of times when you have some drying vegetation like this, you've got little spiders that set up shop. And so they're a tasty little morsel. Of course, sunflowers are also a host plant for some butterflies and moths, so it could be gleaning for those. And then for other birds like, your seed eaters, they might go after the seeds in the sunflowers. I know y'all mentioned the goldenrods, which are really a great plant for pollinators and for specialist bees and the seed eaters, seed-eating birds. So it does have its uses, whether you want to try the altissima, which is the more aggressive, and the Wildflower Center really recommends the Solidago nemorales, which is the short prairie form, which isn't as you know, as exuberant. And then here we have a little pine siskin. This is not the year for pine siskins, at least down here in Austin, but on a Maximilian sunflower, the seeds that hadn't been cut back, doing its thing. Cedar elms, okay, they set their seeds or samaras in the fall. That's this plant right here. This is a live oak. And it's a very beautiful tree and it just really, really pretty darn well behaved. But in the fall, it does set these samaras. And you see on our left, a house finch is in here just chowing down, as is a female cardinal. So it's a good plant for, nest sites too. And then grasses provide seeds. Some, like our big muley, these will spike and then the flowers open, get pollinated and close back up, and set the seeds. And these should be left with their seeds on them so that birds can access them. Things like painted buntings I've watched perch on these the grass leaves, and they're a little heavy, these birds, but they can cling and they will eat the seeds out. So this is unfortunately in Austin the time when landscape crews think, oh my gosh, we better get in there and tidy that up, and they cut it back to less than 6 inches, and then they're dead. So it's better if you have this plant to maintain it by using a rake to just rake out the dead leaves from the bottom. And occasionally the Wildflower Center actually does a kind of a spot burn there, that top picture. So this is it being used in a successful landscape around a small lake. And just keep in mind that your small passerines like this painted bunting have pretty small bills, so they like small seeds, which they can get out of a plant like this. And some butterflies use the grasses. The skipper butterflies use some grasses as their host plants. So some birds actually do eat foliage and buds, and the two I'm thinking of are the lesser goldfinch, which you can see in this picture. they're actually eating the leaves. They'll eat the leaves of this, they'll eat the leaves of some of your Agertinas, and I imagine other things too. If you've got Swiss chard in your garden or kale, apparently they like that too. But I think that sometimes people look at this and they go, "Oh my gosh, the caterpillars are really out, and I better go spray." So the wrong thing to do. This plant was in my yard and it looks a little ratty, but I'll tell you, it still bloomed just fine. So, so mom told them to eat their vegetables, so they're eating the leaves. So plateau goldeneye, this is just I'm not 100% sure that this is in your area, but it did show in the NIPSOT database that it could be grown there. So this different stages of the plateau goldeneye, which is what the little goldfinches were eating, and it provides nice nectar source for a nice platform for your butterflies, and then it sets seeds and it provides really nice stalks in the winter months that I've watched birds perching on. Okay, so the last thing that birds eat, besides sap, I didn't really talk about sap, is vertebrates. It just depends, okay? So a little screech owl like this is going to eat a lot of vertebrates. So that's the reason for the leaf litter. That's the reason that we need to have fewer pesticides or no pesticides in our yard so that little vertebrate can have its normal life cycle too. It just depends on who you are, whether you've got a great blue heron that's raiding your koi pond. They eat fish, but they also eat a lot of rodents, interestingly enough, in upland situations. If I'm a Cooper's hawk, I might try for the squirrel, or in this case, I might be a Cooper's hawk that's got a grackle. So it is a bird-eating hawk. So we just have to make sure that we provide food, water, shelter, and places to raise young for all these other creatures too, in order to have a ecosystem that works for us. So just a few quick comments. In terms of other things that we need to provide different layers of habitat. So birds have a place to nest, a place to look and look around them before they fly further. So at the canopy level, different birds like different parts of the vertical landscape. And this is a generalization from Texas Parks and Wildlife that we have our canopy birds like owls. You'll always find your owl nests up pretty high. Not all warblers are canopy warblers. Those are the ones that we get warbler neck from. It's just so hard looking straight up. Then we have our mid-story, so maybe 15 to 20 feet. Those are favored by jays, chickadees, and titmice, and you've got some trees that might qualify, and when they're fully grown, they might be in this 15 to 20 foot high range, which I think is just a real approximation. Understory, this is the layer that we're missing the most. That's where a lot of birds like um, to forage underneath things so that they don't get taken out by birds like that Cooper's hawk. And then the ground level where you find your native sparrows, not house sparrows, we're talking our native sparrows, cardinals, doves, and wrens. They like that ground cover layer, which doesn't have to all be one level like St. Augustine. It can be patchy. It can be some of your grama grasses or sedges. Those kinds of things will provide food for the birds. So, and you don't have to have all these layers if you don't want to. You can do a beautiful butterfly garden and still be a nice source of lots of things, lots of foods for birds. So just in terms of design practices, an easy thing to do is if you've got a lot of green grass, just figure out what kind of shrub would do really well in your landscape and try one in a corner, and you will find that the birds will use it. And another thing to do is to add a variety of things. Birds are visual, so they're going to notice very quickly what you put into the landscape. And it just is amazing how they notice things so quickly. Evergreens are great, especially to stop the wind. if you can possibly stand not to cut back, if we're talking about the polar vortex one more time, those little pupa can probably make it through that are on those plants. And if we cut them off to the ground now, you're going to be minus one round of food sources for the birds. So resisting the urge to tidy up is very hard, but I suggest bird watching as a tonic so that you can get out of the house and not look at your landscape. Water, go ahead and add a water feature of some kind. And again, add understory plants. And two understory plants that you might really enjoy if you don't have them already are elbow bush, which is called spring herald because it blooms so early and it attracts all these tiny little pollinators. And I don't know why it's so important, so popular in my yard, but I see birds now, it's deciduous, so there are no leaves, but they're popping in and out of there, and I just don't have a clue why they like it so much, but they do. And some of them even will nest in things in elbow bush, like this little blue-gray gnatcatcher. I saw them nesting at one of our local parks. So the female of this plant does produce purple berries, which is going to be popular with your berry eating birds too. It's something to keep in mind. And you can cut it, it'll be fine if you need to, just tame it a little bit. The other plant that sets fruit in about May, June is your fragrant sumac. Rhus aromatica. I guess Rhus trilobata is now the same thing. They're lumped together. But this plant does sucker, but it creates these beautiful little red berries that are very popular with the birds. But I suggest put it somewhere where you can contain it, like here it is bounded by concrete, so it can't go any further than that concrete in that particular direction. And it's really a dainty looking little shrub that you might enjoy. And just remember that plants have a job to do for birds, and beauty really is in the eye of the beholder. And I, for one, think that making this little bluebird happy with Virginia creeper is a wonderful choice that I can make. And here we have some trash plants to us, but I just had to put this in because it maybe increases our appreciation of natural spaces like your green belts. I've always thought poverty weed, Baccharis neglecta, has been kind of a ugly looking weedy plant. But you know what? I see butterflies on it. Here's a little clay colored sparrow that was in fall migration that was eating the seeds of the poverty weed. I thought that was pretty cool. This was last fall. Here's a little hermit thrush eating poison ivy berries. That's why you have poison ivy sometimes if you've got a little bird, who's pooping out the seeds in your yard. And then here's a little female indigo bunting. She's not as striking as the male blue one, but she's perched up on a little sideways, I don't know what, looks like maybe some kind of, I don't know, bone and axe or something. But she has to perch somewhere so that she can pick out the seeds of the bristlegrass, which the southwestern bristlegrass is a good plant to even consider putting in your landscape because your small-billed birds will like it. So yeah, they might be trash plants, but they certainly fulfill a place in the ecosystem. So with all that said, I'd suggest that I hope there was something in this talk that kind of stimulated you to go, oh, I'm going to try that plant. And because gardening for birds will really help bring your yard to life and it's a very satisfying experience. So here's an example of a broad-tailed hummingbird. We have a lot of wintering broad-tailed hummingbirds this year. For some crazy reason, they're rare, but there are probably at least 10 that we know of in town. And here it is on January 4th, visiting my friend Terry Banks' yard, nectaring on Turk's cap. So who knew, right? We always have surprises, and some of you probably have rufous hummingbirds overwintering. So they need if you can provide for them, they need some nectar besides just your nectar from sugar water, but they also eat about 60% of their diet as insects. So having gnats and that kind of thing are really important for them. So with that, here are the resources. A lot of pictures came um, from the Wildflower Center or Meg Inglis and I, and you've got some plant collections. Anyway, there are lots of things that will be on the handout that Tim's provided for you. So with that, Tim, I'm through and I'm ready for a few questions if we have time.
All right, yeah. We here we have one to start with from Sheila, who asked, well, you were talking about the trees and which ones are a good invertebrate host. She asked about hackberries as an
Yes,
invertebrate host.
hackberries they're wonderful trees. The birds really like them. This year we had kind of crazy droughty weather, and really a lot of plants didn't set their berries like they should have. And so I've seen more cedar waxwings and hackberries than ever before. That said, hackberries can be problematic. They don't have real deep root systems, and they have a tendency, the bigger and better they get, the more likely they are to fall over. So I would choose my place very carefully. I have several hackberries, and I do worry about some of them falling, and so they do become kind of an expense. So, some people, I know that we have a entomologist here, Mike Quinn, and he says just chop them back and they'll let them be short, every year let them grow back, but don't let them get to be big trees, but they'll still be a wonderful larval host plant for your butterflies and moths, but you don't have the problem and the expense of one falling over and taking out your fence, which I've had happen, I have to say.
Ouch.
Yeah, it gets to be kind of expensive, but
Um,
they are just such good plants for the birds. They really are.
Here's a question from Laura. She asks, I have a teeny yard. Is there one tree or shrub you recommend that would be a good welcomer?
I would, you all know your plants up there so much better than I know your plants. The beautyberry is a very interesting, easy to grow plant. It I think there's a dwarf version, but you said a very small yard, maybe not. Maybe that the sumac or a nice elbow bush because you can contain it pretty nicely. Of course, you can cut back your beautyberry too if you need to. Um, what did you say? Did you say a tree? She wants
A tree or shrub?
a tree or a shrub. I'm you know what? I'm gonna beg off on that because I don't want to lead you astray. But think about what we've talked about here. Native, we want it to be a native, and we want it to have some value, either berries or nectar or seeds. And then you kind of, with that in mind, you start looking for that perfect plant, whether because for you it might be, is it a fenced yard? I mean, can you grow a vine? Vines can be great, like the coral honeysuckle, and birds, and they set berries, so they're a good source of nectar. They're a host plant for the snowberry clearwing moth. What do you say, Tim? I mean, or
Oh,
Carol?
I,
Well, actually.
I would say both from personal experience and that you have it. You listed, as you said, the beautyberry, the fragrant sumac, the possum hall holly. I mean, those are
Mhm.
three that are
Yeah.
relatively small for a tiny yard. I think.
Yeah. I think probably, you know
Um,
what? I think I agree with you. The possum haw. That's
yeah.
just such a stunning plant. And you can cut on those too, actually.
I'd
Um,
consider
Speak.
Mexican plum for small tree as well.
okay, that's a beautiful. And Kelly Bender Simone, she's a urban biologist with Texas Parks and Wildlife. And she said that there's one over at TPWD headquarters here on Smith School Road that in the early spring, that Mexican plum is just covered with all sorts of pollinators. So, and then it has the fruits later on. And that plant, Mexican plum, can be very xeric once it's established. There's some here that don't get any supplemental water, and they're out in the middle of hot baking sun by Lake Travis, and I don't understand why they're doing so well, but they are. It's a great plant.
Speaking of possum haw holly, Susan asked if the berries have to be ripe for the cedar waxwings to eat them.
You know, I think that they do, because why are they waiting? You know, they must be waiting for them to be just right. That's all I can figure out, because there's some around town, it's like, I mean, we have some possum haws around town and they haven't been touched yet, but we know the cedar waxwings are here. So either they just haven't gotten to them yet, or they're not just perfect. You know, it's like we like our fruits to be perfectly the right stage of ripeness. So, yeah, somebody would have to do some research on that.
Other questions?
Well, great presentation. This is Rodney. I want to make mention of your Eastern Red Cedar.
Oh,
I
yeah.
have a couple in my yard, and it's actually a great hummingbird plant because
Really?
hummingbirds will go and pick off the little arachnids and other assorted little things right off the tips. I can always find two or three hummingbirds around that plant in my yard.
That
Never
is
fails.
very interesting. Huh.
If you watch your behavior, they'll go right to the tips of the branches and the little leaves or whatever you want to call them, and
Yeah, yeah.
um, you'll just see them keep going back and forth, and they'll go to that just as much as they do the flowers. So
Yeah, you know, the last few days here, my little hummingbirds, I have three, and that they just haven't been coming to the feeder. And except for maybe once in the morning and once in the evening. And they're out and collecting insects. Now, I don't have a whole bunch of ash juniper, but they perch in the mountain laurel a lot. And they do, where they go is our live oaks. There are a lot of gnats in the live oaks, and you can see them. They're the hummingbirds just flying around, you know, and you think, what is it doing? Well, it's just catching little gnats.
right,
So
they
even,
spend almost 50% of their time doing that.
yeah,
They have to have protein.
yeah, right.
Um,
Yeah, sugar water is not enough. Well, thank you for telling me about the red cedar, because I'm sure the ash juniper would be the same way.
yeah.
We have juniper hair streak butterflies that use the junipers too. So those are just tiny little caterpillars.
Yeah, yeah. They are beautiful little butterfly.
Here's a question about a hummingbird feeder. Do you have a recommendation on best placement for a hummingbird feeder?
Well, Mark Clem, who used to be with Texas Parks and Wildlife, said they really like to see the sky. They really want to, you know, they're watching out for predators, although really they're not really going to be taken by a Cooper's hawk, you know. Um, so I find that I put them kind of unfortunately in the sun, which makes the nectar not last as long. But that way, where they like to perch so they can look out over my yard and see what's going on. Although I do have one in the shade, and some of the shyer hummingbirds do use that. So I just I would not put it like, don't put it too close to your windows. Some people do, and Cornell Lab recommends putting feeders close to windows. But in this case, if it gets spooked, it might hit your window instead of going out towards the yard. So I have mine put at probably 10 feet from my windows, with a deck mount hanger, you know, that I hang them on. You want to make sure that your raccoons can't get their feeders, or you'll be shelling out for another feeder. They're really quite destructive. So I bring my feeders in every night. Um, and also get a feeder that has an ant moat, ANTMOAT, so that you put water in it so the ants can't get into the nectar. That's something else. But I would say freestanding, get a hook and hang it out, your feeder out under, you know, on a tree branch that the squirrels, etc., can't reach. And that works.
Other questions? Well, I'll throw two out, Jane. What
Okay.
is in the picture you have up now, what is the robin eating?
Oh, I do not know that somebody let me use that picture
Okay.
and
It's not
I
a
don't
cockroach, is it?
I really I can't it has all those little stringy looking things.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
really don't know.
My question more slash comment is back to the fragrant sumac,
Uh-huh.
which I have quite a bit in my yard. And I also have coralberry.
Mm.
And
Yeah, me
I'm
too.
always surprised how much those sparrows, as you mentioned, the sparrows, wrens love that sumac being under it, and there's quite a bit of leaf litter, and they certainly love that, but also under the coralberry. But boy, they certainly gravitate to the sumac, and I don't know if there's other factors, and some could be it's easier for me to see the sumac than the
Uh-huh.
coralberry. But any explanation there for why some of that difference?
I'm sorry, but I don't know. Uh, see, I guess my I had totally forgotten about my coral berry, and I just saw a little berry like yesterday. I saw, oh, you know, um, so normally the birds don't seem to go after the coral berries that much.
Yeah, yeah.
Have you noticed that? I think they must have to fall to the ground because I hear and I see movement because the coral berry grows fairly dense and they're down in there foraging. But I don't know. I don't know
I
how
think
that
some things, are maybe foods of last resort. And in some years they won't use them at all. But in a tough year when things aren't available, those may be the last things eaten, but the things that are truly needed that year.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point because, like inland sea oats, that's one that people say, well, you got to have inland sea oats, and the deer eat mine. But the year of Winter Storm Uri, oh my gosh, I ran out of seed, and of course we couldn't leave our house, and so I cut all the seeds and I sprinkled them in the backyard for the birds, and they ate them. So it was
Oh,
that definitely a food of last
oh,
resort. So it may be that the fragrant sumac just tastes better than the coral berry. I don't know.
yeah.
And
Um,
the fruit fragrant sumac, of course, here it sets fruits in like June, I'd say, whereas the coral berry, it's now, isn't it? So maybe they have to ripen up a little bit more. I don't know. Or freeze and thaw a few more times.
a question here about pruning of coral honeysuckle.
Huh.
Um, any recommendations on a pruning schedule for coral honeysuckle?
Oh my goodness. I would defer. I think you have Carol Clark in the room, don't you?
Yes,
She would
yes.
know. Mine is up on a trellis and
But I'm lazy. I
uh,
don't prune mine.
I don't prune mine either. It's just it's supposed to grow, and that's what it's doing. It froze back some during that winter storm, and it's taken what 3 or 4 years to recover.
For,
But
for what it's worth, of mine it's so hardy and grows so well. I just prune it when it gets too big.
uh-huh.
I know, and it certainly comes back strong. I think it's important to prune it to help keep it shape and I think make it stronger. All right, any other questions? All right, Jane. Well, thank you so much.
Well, this was
Great
fun. I really
presentation.
appreciate it. Thank you. Y'all
Well,
have a
thank you,
good day.
Jane. I appreciate the presentation. It's very good. And it is if you want to attract birds to your yard and we put these plants in there, you'll get it. Yesterday, I had 29 species in my yard. So,
Wow, that is excellent.
if you plant it, they will come.
That's true.
Well, I want to thank everybody for attending tonight, especially all the new members, first time attending. Welcome. And I'd like to welcome everybody from other chapters. I noticed we had quite a few, so I appreciate it. Thank you.